what we're looking at here is Trump's migration agenda, and there are many aspects to this agenda. This lists many of the things we could look at. We thought initially the big one is really the first one, and that is, what if a large number of people, as Michael mentioned, what if they're deported from the US economy, illegal migrants are pulled out of the economy? What does that actually mean for individual sectors within the US economy, spillovers to other countries, and the macroeconomic adjustment in the US economy? So in doing that, the technique is to use a model of the global economy. It's important to use a global model for many of the questions that are being raised by the election. In the case of migration, it's really what you're doing in the US economy is really focused on the US economy. But what we're doing here is we're going to compare two scenarios. What if we take candidate Trump at his word and 1.3 million workers are removed from the economy? And the second scenario is take all of the illegal workers, which is roughly 7.5 million workers, are removed from the US economy. So they're two scenarios. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply an economic model. The model is published widely, but in the Handbook of CGE Modelling, joint model with my co-author, Peter Wilcoxon. And this model is quite complex. In fact, we take Michael Clemens' comment very seriously that the cartoon economy is far too simplistic, and what we want to capture is not just the way the macroeconomy functions, but the interlinkages within the economy and production processes. So we have production networks, we have financial allocation across sectors and across countries. We look at both the domestic production processes and international model, a lot of linkages, and that's important because we're pulling workers out of particular sectors, which is going to lead to adjustment throughout the economy. And in many cases, particularly if you're looking at trade policy, it leads to adjustment in other countries, which feeds back into the US. So this model has a lot of short-term frictions. We don't have full employment. We have business cycles. We have costs in moving capital from one sector to another. So if you do something dramatic, like pull a lot of workers out of one sector, there's a lot of capital sitting in that sector that can't easily be moved somewhere else. And so what happens is the return to that capital goes down if there are less workers working with that capital. So we're picking up an adjustment in the short term. And again, we're phasing this in 2025, half the workers are removed, and in 2026, the rest of the workers are removed. And so we are trying to look at the short run and the medium term impacts. Now, again, as I mentioned, the model is large, it's global, it's modeling of the G20. For this particular exercise, we could have just had the US because the migration story very much is a story of US supply shocks within the US economy. What's important is we're modelling the economy across 6 different sectors: energy, mining, agriculture, manufacturing of durable goods, manufacturing of non-durable goods and services. And so we're trying to pick up the impacts at the sectoral level, as well as looking at the feedbacks through the macroeconomy. Now, the data we're using, again, we have to know how many workers are deemed to be illegal or unauthorized migrants in different sectors. So we're using data from 2017. This table shows you the 5 of the 6 sectors. There's not much happening in the energy sector, so we're focusing on the other 5 sectors. We have the total civilian labour force of 162 million people. When you look at estimates of illegal versus unauthorized immigrants, what we're focusing on here is this final column. What's the share of unauthorized immigrants in each of these sectors who are working? And so if you look in mining, 3.3% of the mining workforce are deemed to be unauthorized. Now, one thing to notice from this is firstly that the distribution is not equal across sectors. In fact, it's quite obvious when you think about it, but there's a lot of illegal workers in agriculture. There's a lot in manufacturing. There's a lot in construction. And so what we're doing is moving different amounts of these illegals. We're assuming that in proportion to their employment in those sectors. So when we pull these workers out, we're going to be pulling out a lot more workers from agriculture than we are pulling out from services. And there is a lot of complexity when you look at Michael's work on skilled versus unskilled and a whole range of other very deep labour market issues. We assume that the workers you're pulling out have the average productivity of workers in that sector. So we're making some simplifications because we're just trying to get a ballpark estimate of just how big the overall impact might be. And so what we do then is we project the world, making some assumptions. We then undertake the scenario. One scenario is 1.3 million workers removed proportionately across these sectors in relation to their occupation in those sectors. And we compare the two scenarios between the 1.3 million workers and the 7.5 million workers. And what we show on these charts is the change in GDP relative to what it would have been if you hadn't undertaken that policy. Now, two things to note. Firstly, on the left-hand chart, US GDP in the first year is roughly 1% lower in 2025 than it would have been. But then you get a very sharp drop in GDP relative to what it would have been. In fact, the growth rate between 2025 and 2026 in this scenario is sharply negative. So the US economy slows down. Notice that if you look to the right of that graph, it slows down and you have permanently less GDP because you're taking 7.5 million workers out of the economy forever. And so relative to what the economy would have looked like, you have this long run effect. But secondly, you have a business cycle impact because once the workers are pulled out of these sectors, the return on capital in those sectors changes. The factories can't move. They're stuck in those sectors for a number of years. So the marginal return on capital goes down, incomes go down, shareholder value goes down. And so you end up with a decline in demand, investment will go down, consumption will go down. So while most of this is a supply shock in terms of removing workers, initially the reevaluation of incomes and wealth in the US creates also a demand shock. And so you end up with an overshoot on the downside. And this is a traditional business cycle, macroeconomic Keynesian side of mechanism. So you get a slowdown out through 2030 before the economy starts to bounce back, but never back to the level that it was. On the right-hand side, you can see that the impacts of a smaller mass migration of 1.3 million people is proportionately smaller. So we'll focus on the left-hand side graphs because that's where most of the action is. Notice that spillovers to other countries are remarkably small. This is not true in the trade simulations we've been doing as particularly related to China. What happens to inflation? Again, on the left, this is the change in inflation relative to what it would have been, and we get 2% higher inflation in the first year and then 3% higher inflation in the second year before the Fed starts to adjust policy and the Fed eventually gets inflation back to where it was. That's an assumption of the Fed's reaction in the model. Notice that this is generally inflationary at the global level, but most of the impact is on the US economy. Again, a smaller shock, a smaller impact on inflation. Now, what's important here, and this is something worth stressing, is people tend to confuse inflation with price level changes. So if you get 3% inflation for 3 years in a row, higher than it would have been, then the price level in 3 years' time is 9% higher than it would have been. This is when you get an inflation cost of living crisis. If incomes aren't growing, but inflation is growing, each year goods are more and more expensive. So this chart shows you over the next few years what happens to the price of various outputs within each sector. So notice that agriculture prices by 2028 are 10% higher than they would have been. So even though the Fed is already taking inflation out of the economy by tightening monetary policy, the price level is staying permanently higher. And so you can see that it's different across sectors. The prices have gone up most in agriculture. Not surprising, that's where a lot of workers have been taken from. But you can also see that there's this distribution across the economy. If you rescale less workers, you still get higher prices, but it's not quite the same scale. What happens to employment when the US deports these workers? And you can see the employment rate drops dramatically. It looks very much like GDP. So you end up getting the workers that are gone, and then the workers that stay in the US, as Michael's results show, is you've destroyed American jobs of American workers as well. And so you do get this sort of overshoot, which is consistent with Michael's results. What happens to the trade balance? And this is kind of an interesting story because one thing you do notice here is that if you really do remove a lot of workers from the US economy, the trade balance improves. Now, some people might find that counterintuitive, but the way the model works is if you reduce the number of workers in the economy, the return to capital goes down. Foreign investment won't flow to the US economy. In fact, US investment and foreign investment will flow somewhere else where the returns are higher. That will cause the US dollar to weaken. That'll improve exports in the US and reduce imports. And this trade surplus we start with is actually the relocation of capital. So not only are you moving workers out of the US economy, you're moving capital out of the US economy. And that leads you to a short-run improvement in the trade balance, which is not necessarily good news, and a long-run deterioration in the trade balance. And you can see again, some countries, Canada, for example, attracts a lot of that capital because the firms that would have invested in the US economy find labour more available in the Canadian economy, and therefore you get a capital inflow. What happens to sectoral employment? And this is where having this sectoral disaggregation is really quite interesting. So remember that most of the workers initially are being pulled out of agriculture, and there is workers being pulled out of manufacturing as well. What happens when the economy contracts and investment dries up, well, not dries up, but is reduced? The sector that investment is drawn from to build factories is the durable goods sector. So you buy steel, you buy aluminum, you're buying goods from the durable goods sector, that demand dries up. So that sector gets hit not only with a lower labour supply, but it also gets hit with a second round decline in demand because there's an investment slump in the US. That shows up in the durable manufacturing sector being much more heavily impacted than the other sectors in the economy. What happens in sectoral output? Well, the employment and output numbers look very similar, although they're not exactly the same, because workers can move around the economy, but you do get quite a significant reduction in manufacturing, which is kind of ironic because that is a sector that candidate Trump is arguing wants to create more jobs. And unfortunately, the cartoon economy doesn't work in the real world. What happens to equity prices? They slump dramatically. So this is the value of equities. This is a very large fall, particularly in durable manufacturing, but also in mining and other sectors. And eventually they settle at a much lower level, but you're running down the capital stock. So the value of capital starts to recover as the marginal product of capital starts to get back to where it was. So what do we get? What's the answer that we find? This is a summary table, and here we're accumulating over 3 years those percentage point deviations. So if you deport 7.5 million workers, you get a midpoint estimate, and I should mention there's some uncertainty here because the parameterization of the model has enormous amount of uncertainty, but under the best guess parameterization, by over 3 years, GDP is 12% lower than it otherwise would have been cumulatively. Inflation is 7.4%. If you accumulate, that's the price level effect. Prices will be basically 7.4% higher than otherwise. Employment measured by hours worked will be 8.1% lower cumulatively. You have a better trade balance, but that's reflecting a loss of capital and a loss of potential jobs in the future to a US economy. And you get a very large slump in durable manufacturing employment. Initially, because of the investment slowdown, that does eventually recover. So what do we learn? As Adam said at the beginning, the deportation of workers is really a big supply shock in the US economy. It's focused initially in agriculture, services and manufacturing, but the linkages in the economy imply that the second round effects could actually accentuate and do accentuate durable manufacturing shock in a negative way. Less workers means less production, increase inflation, input costs go up, slowdown in the economy. You do get the inflation spike. You get a smaller inflation spike than you might think of if you just focus on the supply side. So our inflation numbers could be less than other studies because we capture the income and wealth effects on the demand side of the aggregate economy. But again, you can vary those assumptions and see the sensitivity. Overall, the big impact of reducing workers in the US is reducing the return to capital and therefore leading to capital leaving the US together with the workers leaving the US, and that is a fundamental problem. We do have substitution of capital, so firms do, because they've got less workers, they do try and have more capital to try and get their output back to the levels that they find profitable, but basically the return to capital shock dominates the substitution, so you do get lower investment in the US economy. And again, that feeds over very negatively to the durable manufacturing sector because it feeds the investment cycle. And finally, capital flows out of the US economy, weakens the US dollar, but does improve the trade balance. So in that sense, if the candidate's goal is to improve the US trade balance, this is one way to do it, but it's a very expensive way to do it. And I will stop sharing there. Thank you very much.